Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in the Great Northwest, Joseph in Massachusetts, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Clarice wishing everyone a good evening from Mexico City. Ella's in the house, Mickey Stein catching us live. Moises in Las Vegas, Marjorie with us, Yitzhak in Minnesota, and Aoife. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by our dear friend Lionel Leventhal, in memory of Carmen Santaella. She will be dearly missed. And may our learning today accrue to her merit in the world of souls and lift her up a little higher. And Lionel, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Your gift is truly appreciated. It's going to allow more people to learn, and that's a beautiful thing. And may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say amen. Okay. Our daf today is page 79 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 8. Today commencing with Mishna number 3, and we're picking that up actually near the bottom of page 78a. Mishna number 3. If the woman was standing in the public domain and her husband took the bill of divorce and threw it to her, if it fell closer to her, she is divorced. And if it fell closer to him, she is not divorced. And if it is equally balanced, there is uncertainty as to whether she is divorced or whether she is not divorced. And the same laws apply with regard to betrothal. Now, before we even finish reading this Mishnah, this strikes us as insane. What are you talking about? We said that the basic law is that when the husband is going to give a get to his wife, okay, so it has to be placed in her hand. That's what the Torah says. And then the sages interpreted, okay, giving it into her hand, it doesn't have to be exactly in her hand, because if she refuses to take the get, it's not like she's going to get out of the divorce by literally not opening her hand to receive the bill of divorce from the husband or his agent. So, okay, you can put it in her courtyard that she controls. But now we're saying that if the husband and the wife are in the public domain and he's going to take this get and just chuck it in her direction, and if it lands closer to her than to him, she's divorced? Really? Does that make sense? Not so fast. Again, this language of throwing, this is really talking about as opposed to literally placing it in her hand. So you're throwing so that it's going to land in a place, or it's going to be placed in a spot that is in her domain. But we just said public domain, closer to her. And the Gemara will clarify what's really going on here, which is that it's going to land in the 4 amos, the 4 cubits in which she is standing, right? So it really is her domain, because we're understood, just like on Shabbos, you can't carry something more than 4 amos, more than 4 cubits in the public domain. Why? Because those 4 cubits in which you're standing is understood to be your personal space. It's not like you own it. Obviously, you're standing in the public domain. Nevertheless, the immediate environment that we're standing in, like our personal space, the 4 cubits around us, that is like her space. So it's not just, he's throwing it from 100 yards away and it lands on the 51-yard line, and somehow this is closer to her, so she's divorced and she might never even realize that happened. That's not what's going on. And the Mishnah continues, and the same laws apply with regard to a debt. If his creditor said to him, "Throw the payment of my debt to me," and he threw it to him, and the money fell closer to the creditor. So then the creditor acquired the payment, and the debtor is absolved of all his obligation to pay, even if the money did not reach the creditor's hand. For example, it was stolen or lost after it was thrown and before the creditor was able to take it. But again, we're making a comparison, and the creditor said, "Throw it to me." Why would that happen? Actually, having lived through a pandemic, sometimes people don't want to hand something to someone else. Sometimes people don't want to come within 4 cubits of another person. They want that personal distancing. And so they say, okay, throw it to me. And so then it becomes valid if the throw is close enough, right? So the debtor is absolved of his obligation to pay, even if the money did not actually reach the creditor's hand, if it was stolen or lost after it was thrown and before the creditor was able to take it, because the creditor said, "Throw it to me," and it landed close to him, which really means within the 4 cubits. And if it fell closer to the debtor and the money was lost, then the debtor is still obligated to pay because it actually never left his own 4 cubits. And if it was equally balanced and was lost, then the two of them divide the loss, i.e. the debtor owes half the amount. That's Mishnah number 3. Here's the Gemara. And the Gemara clarifies that which was taught in the Mishnah. What is considered closer to her and what is considered closer to him? Rav says, if it fell within 4 cubits of her. This is what is meant by the Mishnah's statement, closer to her. This is actually legal jargon. Closer to her means in her 4 cubits of personal space. And if it fell within 4 cubits of him, this is what is meant by closer to him. And the Gemara asks, what is considered midway? And Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says, such as when the two of them were standing within the same 4 cubits. And the Gemara asks, and let us see which of them preceded the other into these 4 cubits. And the 4 cubits would then be considered as belonging to that person. If they're standing in the same 4 cubits, it's a small area. It's like a 6 foot by 6 foot square. So if they're standing in that same square, okay, well, who owns that personal space? The one who entered it first. And if you would say that both of them came simultaneously into that little area, but isn't there a principle that it is impossible to be so precise? It is not possible that both events occurred at exactly the same time, and it is certain that one of them arrived before the other. So rather, Rav Kahana said, here we are dealing with a case of precisely 8 cubits, where his 4 cubits are adjacent to her 4 cubits, and the get extends from his 4 cubits into her 4 cubits, meaning that part of the get is in his 4 cubits and part is in hers. Therefore, in this case, there is uncertainty whether she is divorced or whether she is not divorced, right? So they're standing exactly the distance apart so that his personal space of 4 square cubits, abuts her personal space of 4 square cubits, and the get lands right on the edge between them. Now the Gemara asks, but isn't the get still attached to him, since part of it is within his 4 cubits, and therefore cannot be considered as if he gave it to her, since it's still partially in his 4 cubits. So rather, one should explain, as Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say, here we are dealing with 2 groups of witnesses. One says that the get fell closer to him, and the other group says that the get fell closer to her. Therefore, the expression in the Mishnah, equally balanced, is referring not to distance, but rather to the opinions of these 2 pairs of witnesses. As opposed to Rav, who explained that in the Mishnah, the word closer meant within 4 cubits. So Rabbi Yochanan says, we learned that closer to her means that the get was actually closer to her, even if it was 100 cubits away from her. And we learned that closer to him means that it was actually closer to him, even if it was 100 cubits away from him, though that didn't become the law. And the Gemara asks, according to the explanation offered by Rabbi Yochanan, what are the circumstances of when it was equally balanced? And Rav Shemin bar Abba said, this was explained to me personally by Rabbi Yochanan himself. If it is so positioned that he can guard it, and she cannot guard it, this is considered closer to him. And if the get was so positioned that she can guard it, and he cannot guard it, this is considered closer to her. If it is so positioned that the two of them can guard it, or the two of them cannot guard it, then this is considered equally balanced. And the rabbis said this explanation before Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yonasan. And Rabbi Yochanan said in amazement, do our Babylonian friends know how to explain in accordance with this explanation? Rabbi Yochanan was astonished that they also understood the issue as he did. And this is also in a Baraisa. Tosefta 8:1, Rabbi Eliezer says, with regard to any get that is closer to her than it is to him, and a dog came and took it before the get reached her hand, she is not divorced. And the Gemara asks, why is it that she is not divorced? Once it was closer to her, before the dog took it, the divorce should have taken effect. Must she continue guarding the bill of divorce indefinitely, even after the get took effect by reaching her domain? And the Gemara answers, rather, is it not that this is what Rabbi Eliezer is saying, with regard to any get that is closer to her than it is to him, and if a dog were to come and attempt to take it, he would be able to guard it, and she would not be able to guard it. In that case, she is not divorced, as the bill of divorce is considered to still be in his domain, and he never actually gave it over. So Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, one with large teeth. That's what Shmuel is calling Rav Yehuda. You, the one with large teeth. But actually, this is a compliment. What it means is sharp one. Right? Shmuel is calling Rav Yehuda sharp one. Right, so what is Shmuel saying to Rav Yehuda? Sharp one, closer to her, it meant so she could bend down and take it. And you should not perform an action to permit a divorcing woman to remarry until the get actually reaches her hand. That's certainly what we would like to see, so there's no room for error. And Rav Mordechai said to Rav Ashi, there was an incident like this, in which the get was closer to the woman than to the man, and it was then lost. And after her husband died, they required the woman to engage in the ritual through which the Yavam frees the Yavam of her levirate bonds, right? Halitza. In other words, this husband died without children and left a brother. And they were unsure whether she was divorced or not, so that's why they made her perform Halitza with the brother, because she might have been a widow, since this bill of divorce was a little bit uncertain, owing to the fact that the get was closer to her, but it was lost before it reached her hand. Now the Mishna stated the law about a get that was closer to him or her, and the Mishna added, and the same laws apply with regard to betrothal. So Rabbi Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says they said these laws only with regard to bills of divorce, but not with regard to another matter. And Rabbi Abba raised an objection to this statement of Rabbi Asi from that which was explicitly taught in the Mishnah. And the same laws apply with regard to betrothal. He responded, it is different there with regard to betrothal, as it is written, and she departs out of his house, out of her father's house, and goes and becomes another man's wife. So the Torah thereby compares betrothal through the use of the word becomes to divorce through the use of the words and she departs. So one can learn the laws of betrothal from the laws of divorce. One cannot learn halachas concerning other matters from divorce. Right? The betrothal and divorce share this idea that when a woman becomes betrothed, she becomes prohibited to all other men in the world and permitted only to her husband or her husband-to-be. But remember that betrothal, if you break it off, requires a bill of divorce. Likewise, when a woman gets divorced, she becomes prohibited to her ex-husband, and now she's permitted to marry anyone she wants out in the world. So you can see why betrothal and divorce would have related laws, as opposed to the laws of gifts or debts or contracts or other areas of the law that might share some similarities with divorce or betrothal, but are not fundamentally related the way divorce and betrothal are related. Now, another objection to this statement was raised based on what is taught in a Baraisa, and the same laws apply with regard to a debt. If a creditor said to a debtor, throw the payment for my debt to me, and he threw it to him and the money fell closer to the creditor, the debtor merits, i.e., his debt is repaid. If it fell closer to the debtor and the money was lost, the debtor is still obligated to pay. If the money was equally balanced between them and then it was lost, the two of them divide the loss. So accordingly, the laws of debts are comparable to the laws of divorce. And the Gemara answers, here we are dealing with a case where the creditor said to the debtor, throw the payment for my debt to me, and you will be absolved of your obligation to pay through this. So the Gemara challenges this. If so, what is the purpose of stating this? Since he made an explicit stipulation, it is obvious that the outcome will be in accordance with his stipulation. And the Gemara answers, no. It is necessary in a case where the creditor said to the debtor, throw the payment for my debt to me according to the procedure in effect with bills of divorce, meaning that the law that applies to divorce should apply here too. And the Gemara asks, and still, what is the purpose of stating this, since the creditor stated explicitly, or stipulated explicitly, okay, according to the laws of the get. So the Gemara answers, lest you say that the creditor can say to the debtor, I am teasing you, and what I stipulated has no validity. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that if he stipulated that it should be treated like a get, then his stipulation takes effect. New subject. Rav Chisda says, if the get was in her hand and a string tied to the get remained in his hand as he gave her the get, if he gave her the get in this way, in such a way that the husband can still pull the get out of her hand with this string that's attached to the get and to his hand, then she is not divorced. Why is she not divorced? Because he didn't give her the get. He maintained some kind of possession of the get by having this string tied to from one end of the string to his hand, the other end to the get, and then he handed her the get. Like, why would he do that? I can't imagine. But again, they're stating this hypothetical so that we understand the law. Now you see this in like TikTok videos, or YouTube videos, where somebody puts some money on the ground, there's some fishing line tied to it, and when somebody goes to pick it up, they pull the money along the ground as if it's being blown by the wind. Okay, that's a gag, but if somebody were to try to do that with a get, well then the giving of the get would be completely invalidated because the husband is retaining some control of the get, and he cannot do that. He must give it to her in order to effectuate the divorce. Right, what is the reason that she's not divorced despite the fact that he gave her a get? The reason is we require severance of the husband from the get, severance of the husband from the wife, right? That's what's creating a divorce. And in this case, severance is lacking since the husband still has a hold of the get through this string that is tied to it. And Rav Yehuda says, if her hand was positioned like a slope, and he threw the get to her, despite the fact that the get reached her hand, she is not divorced, since it cannot remain in her hand and it will fall out. And the Gemara asks why? But when the get falls from her hand, it falls within her 4 cubits. And the husband and the Gemara answers, Rav Yehuda is discussing a case where the get did not rest within 4 cubits. Rather, it fell further away. And the Gemara asks, but why not let her be divorced because the get was in the airspace of her 4 cubits? And if you do not say this, then resolve the dilemma that Rabbi Lazar raised with regard to the 4 cubits that the sages stated in the laws of acquisition. Do they have airspace with the same legal status, or do they not have airspace? Resolve that dilemma from here, i.e. they do not have airspace. But the Gemara rejects this. One cannot resolve the dilemma from here, since it is possible to say that here we are dealing with a woman who is standing at the riverbank, as the get stands to be destroyed from the outset. If it falls out of her hand, it's going to fall in the river. So you can't say that once the get falls out, that it lands in her 4 cubits because it's swept away by the river. In all these cases, we're testing the limits of the law, but obviously, if you really want to make sure you get divorced, put it in her hand. If she refuses to take it, make sure that the witnesses see that it lands at her feet within her 4 cubits. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Now we're at the top of page 79a with Mishnah number 4, here in chapter 8. If a woman was standing on top of the roof and her husband was standing below, and he threw a bill of divorce, he threw the get up to her on the roof, So once the get reaches the airspace of the roof, she is divorced. If he was above on the roof and she was below on the ground and he threw the get to her, once it leaves the area of the roof, even if the wording was erased or the document was burned before it reached the ground where she's standing, she is divorced. That's the Mishnah. That ruling, especially about the get being destroyed before it reaches her, this will be disputed successfully in the Gemara. Here's the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. The Gemara asks, but isn't the airspace of the roof unsecured? Since the get can be blown away from the roof by the wind, it should be considered an unsecured courtyard which does not acquire items for its owner. So if so, why is she divorced once the get reaches the airspace of the roof? And Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said we are dealing with a roof that has a parapet. Therefore, it is like a secured courtyard since the get cannot be blown away. In fact, that is the law. If she's standing up on the roof and he manages to throw the get onto the roof where she's standing, it becomes her get. In other words, the courtyard, now this roof is counted as a courtyard and acquires the get for her once it gets over the parapet. Before it actually lands on the ground of the rooftop, but it has to be inside the parapet, as it were. It has to go over the parapet and now be contained within this rooftop that is surrounded by a parapet, and it has to be her rooftop, right? It's her courtyard, like it's her rooftop, like it was her courtyard when we talked about she owns the courtyard. Or it's like the husband's house, but he says, okay, I give you or I lend you the rooftop so that it can acquire the get for her. Ula Bar Menashe said in the name of Avimi that there is another answer. Here we are dealing with a case where the get is within 3 handbreadths of the roof, as anything within 3 handbreadths of the roof is considered to be like the roof itself, based on the principle that views 2 solid surfaces as connected if the gap between them is less than 3 handbreadths wide. Right, so a gap of 3 handbreadths, 1, 2, 3, so about that much, is considered to be not a gap if it's separating between 2 surfaces. And also we talked about that something within 3 handbreadths of the ground is considered to be on the ground. That came up quite a bit when we were talking about in Tractate Shabbos about enclosures that define a private domain versus a public domain, etc. Now, it was taught in the Mishnah, if the husband was above, meaning on the rooftop, and she was below, like on the ground, and he threw the get to her, so once it leaves the area of the roof, she is divorced. This sounds fishy. The Gemara asked, but isn't the airspace of the courtyard down below not secured, since the get can be blown out of the courtyard by the wind? So Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel says we're discussing a case where the lower partitions in the courtyard extend beyond the upper partitions on the roof, so that the get will certainly fall in the courtyard. That's what they're saying. He might be standing on the roof and she's down below, but she's in a courtyard that is defined as her courtyard. And that's why her courtyard can acquire the get for her, and she's standing in it, and there's witnesses watching this, right? So that's when it acquires the get for her. Where am I? And so Rabbi Abba said to Ula, in accordance with whose opinion is this law that once the get enters the woman's domain, it is considered as though it was given to her, even though it was destroyed before it landed on the ground? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, who said that with regard to the prohibition of transferring an item from one domain to another on Shabbos, an object in airspace is considered at rest? Well, this means that any item in the airspace of a domain is considered to be placed within that domain. So what they're testing is this idea, and imagine the rabbinic imagination of this, right? That he throws the get down from the roof to her courtyard. Okay, it's her courtyard. But it gets into her courtyard in the airspace of her courtyard, right? Which is going to be defined minimally by the 3 handbreadths above the ground. Right? So 3 handbreadths, 1, 2, 3, right? So about this much, call it a foot. right? And so the get reaches within 1 foot of the ground. But somehow, before it reaches finishes falling that final foot, it burns up. Okay, so it was considered on the ground because it was within 1 foot of the ground, 3 handbreadths. And before it actually reaches the ground, it gets incinerated. So are they divorced? Right now, obviously there's witnesses there who saw that this was a valid get that's being given. It's not just some random piece of paper and we can't prove what it was because it burned up before it actually reached the ground. But the witnesses saw that it was a valid get. And for whatever reason, before it actually reached the ground, it was damaged, but it entered her courtyard and came within 1 foot of the ground. So the witnesses said, yeah, no, your courtyard acquired it for you. Sorry, you don't have the document to show afterward, but it was a valid document. It came within 1 foot of what is your courtyard. So yeah, your courtyard acquired it, and unfortunately, then it became damaged. In other words, it's the same law as it landed in her courtyard, right? And now they're divorced. And then she was so angry that she picked it up, put it in an ashtray, and burned it. Well, okay, she didn't keep her get, but it was damaged after it reached her domain, and that's why they are divorced. Same idea. Now, Ula answered, you can even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rebbe. Since the rabbis disagree with the Rebbe only with regard to Shabbos, they maintain that with regard to the laws of Shabbos, the item must actually come to rest in the domain to which it was transferred. While it is in the air, it is not considered as though it had landed on the ground. But here, in the case of divorce, it is because the get is secured that she is divorced, and in this case, it is secured while within the airspace of the partitions of her courtyard. So even though it didn't reach the ground before it was damaged or destroyed, it was in a place that belonged to her, that could be guarded by her. Unfortunately, it was damaged, but the divorce took effect. And Rabbi Asi says that Rabbi Yochanan says, we are discussing a case where the lower partitions in the courtyard extend beyond the upper partitions of the roof. So Rabbi Zerah said to Rabbi Asi, in accordance with whose opinion is this law? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, who says that an object in airspace is considered at rest. Is that what you're saying? And Rabbi Asi said to him, you can even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rebbe, since the rabbis disagree with Rebbe only with regard to Shabbos. But here it is because the get is secured that she is divorced, and in this case it is secured within the airspace of the partitions. And it doesn't even have to come within 3 handbreadths, because we're talking about a courtyard whose walls that surround the courtyard extend right up to that parapet of the roof where the husband is standing. So that as soon as he tosses it into the courtyard, right, it's in the airspace of the courtyard. It's totally that courtyard. It's surrounded by walls, and now that get is within those walls, and therefore in the airspace of the courtyard. And even if it doesn't reach the ground, it was in her courtyard, and that's why they are divorced. Now, it was taught in the Mishnah that once the get leaves the domain of the roof, even if the writing was erased before it reached her hand, she is divorced with it. Rav Nachman says that Rabba Bar Abba says they taught this law only when the writing was erased, when it had already left the confines of the roof and was on its descent entering her domain. But if the writing was erased while it was on its ascent, i.e. as it arched upward before falling down, then no, she is not divorced. And what is the reason for this? Because initially, before the get began its descent, the get is not destined to land in her domain, since it could be blown elsewhere. Consequently, it cannot be considered as though it is already resting in her courtyard at that time. How interesting. When you throw something as it's rising, we don't know where it's going to end up. A gust of wind could come, and it could be blown somewhere totally different. Once it's falling, okay, then its trajectory becomes predictable, and we can say that once it enters the airspace of her courtyard, the courtyard acquires the get for her, and they are divorced. But while it's still rising, this get that the husband threw, it could end up anywhere, and we can't say, even if it was over her airspace, we can't say that it would have definitely landed there. So if the writing somehow became erased while it was still ascending, there is no valid divorce. It was taught in the Mishnah that once the get leaves the domain of the roof, even if the document was burned before it reached her hand, she is divorced with it. And here as well, Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Abba says they taught this law only when the throwing of the get preceded the fire. But if the fire preceded the throwing of the get, then the woman is not divorced. And what is the reason for this? Because initially when the get was thrown, it was heading toward being burned, and therefore it is considered that he never gave her the get. Rav Chisda says domains are divided with regard to gets. If there are several areas within the same domain, for example, a house and a courtyard, or a courtyard and a roof, they are not all considered a single domain with regard to a get. Rather, each one is considered to be a separate domain. And Rami bar Chama said to Rava, from where does the elder, meaning Rav Chisda, derive this law? And Rava said to him, it is derived from the Mishnah that taught if the woman was standing on the top of the roof and her husband threw a get to her from below, once the get reaches the airspace of the roof, she is divorced. And Rava explains, with what are we dealing? If we say that we are dealing with the case of her roof and her courtyard, why do I require the get to reach the airspace of the roof in order for her to be divorced? Even if the get remained in the courtyard, she would be divorced since it is her courtyard. Rather, we must be dealing with a case of his roof and his courtyard. But when the get reaches the airspace of the roof, what of it? Why is she then divorced if the get has not left his domain? Rather, it is obvious that we are dealing with a case of her roof and his courtyard. Now, Rava questions this conclusion. Say the latter clause of the Mishnah, which taught if he was above on the roof and she was below, and he threw it to her, once it leaves the area of the roof, even if the wording was erased or the document was burned before it fell to the ground, she is divorced. And if we are dealing with a case of her roof and his courtyard, why is she divorced? Rather, it's necessary to say that we're dealing with a case of his roof and her courtyard. And Rava asks, is it possible that the first clause in the Mishnah is dealing with a case of her roof and his courtyard? And the latter clause in the Mishnah is dealing with a case of his roof and her courtyard? How could the same Mishnah discuss two laws where each one is dealing with a different reality without mentioning that distinction? So Rava explains Rav Chisda's inference. Rather, is it not so that the Mishnah is dealing with a case where both the roof and the courtyard belong to him, but he lent her a place in his domain wherein she could acquire her get, and she is standing in that place? So in the first clause, he lent her the roof, and in the second clause, he lent her the courtyard. Consequently, only once it reaches that domain is she divorced. And the reason why she does not acquire the get until it reaches the specific domain that he lent her is that people lend only one place. People do not lend two places. And Rav Chisda understood that one can infer from the Mishnah that the courtyard and the roof remain as separate domains, and concludes that with regard to a get, different areas in one domain are considered to be multiple domains. Rami bar Chama said to Rava, are the cases comparable? Perhaps this case is as it is, and that case is as it is. I.e., the first clause in the Mishnah is dealing with a case of her roof and his courtyard, and the latter clause of the Mishnah is dealing with a case of his roof and her courtyard. In some instances, one Mishnah deals with two different cases. Therefore, the Mishnah is not an adequate proof of Rav Chisda's statement. So Rava says there are three unique qualities with regard to a get as compared to the laws of Shabbos. The first is that which Rebbe says, an object in airspace is considered at rest, and the rabbis disagree with him. And this matter about which they disagree applies only with regard to Shabbos. But here, in the case of divorce, it is because the get is secured that she is divorced, and once the get is within the airspace of the partitions, it is secured. And so the rabbis agree that she is divorced. And the second distinction is that which Rav Chisda says concerning the laws of Shabbos. In the case of one who embedded a reed in the ground of a private domain, and on its top was a basket, and he threw an object from the public domain, and it rested on top of it, even if the reed was 100 cubits high, he is liable because the private domain extends upward until the sky. Therefore, the object landed in a private domain. This matter applies only with regard to Shabbos. As with regard to Shabbos, domains are defined based on their partitions and the way in which they are used, which differs from the way that domains are defined in other areas of Jewish law. But here, in the case of divorce, it is because the get is secured that she is divorced, and when it is on the reed, it is not secured. And the third distinction, and now we're on page 79b, relates to that which Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, on Shabbos a person should not stand on his roof and a person should not stand on this roof and collect rainwater from the roof of another person if there is no joining of the courtyards, just as the residences are separated below, so too the residences are separated above. Each residence has a separate domain, and it is forbidden by rabbinic law to transfer an item from a private domain to another private domain on Shabbos if they are not joined by an Erev. And similarly, despite the fact that the roofs are not totally separated from one another and nobody lives there, each roof is considered to be its own domain. Rav explains this matter applies only with regard to Shabbos, but with regard to the get, if it fell onto another roof that is adjacent to the roof that he lent her for the purpose of acquiring the get, she is divorced. And the reason that a woman is usually not divorced when a get falls into a different place, even though that place also belongs to her husband, is due to the fact that her husband is particular and does not want to lend her more than one place. But people are not particular to that extent, i.e. to this case. In this case, the husband would not be particular about allowing her to temporarily use an adjacent rooftop that also belongs to him, because what he wants is to lend her part of his property to make it her courtyard so that the get lands in that and she receives it, and therefore they are divorced. And again, this is in the presence of witnesses, and she's going to know that she was divorced. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, please get them in. Abaye says, if there are two courtyards that are configured such that this courtyard is within that courtyard, and the inner courtyard is hers, and the outer courtyard is his, and the partitions of the outer courtyard extend higher than the partitions of the inner courtyard, and he threw a bill of divorce to her into her courtyard, so once it reaches the airspace of the partitions of the outer courtyard, i.e. it reaches the area above the inner courtyard at a height lower than the height of the partitions of the upper courtyard, the outer courtyard, then she is divorced. I mean, try to picture it, but bottom line is it left his courtyard and entered her courtyard, and it was a clearly defined inner courtyard with these partitions that extend upward, and so the get is considered to be in a guarded area that belongs to her, divorced. Now, what is the reason for this? The inner courtyard itself is secured by the partitions of the outer courtyard. Therefore, the outer partitions service the inner courtyard as well. If the get is secured by being encompassed by the outer partitions, it can be viewed as belonging to the inner courtyard once it reaches its airspace. And the Gemara comments, this is not so with regard to baskets. In a case where there are two baskets, and one basket is inside the outer basket, resting in a domain that does not belong to either of them, and the inner basket is hers and the outer basket is his, and he threw a bill of divorce to her into her basket, even if the get reached the airspace of the inner basket but was burned or taken before it landed inside, she is not divorced. What is the reason for this? It is because the get did not yet rest within the basket, and in this case the walls of the outer basket do not service the inner basket. And the Gemara asks, and when it rests within the basket, what of it? They are like the vessels of a buyer in the domain of the seller, since her basket is within his basket, which is his domain. She cannot acquire the get despite the fact that it is in her basket, since it is within his domain. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? With a basket that has no bottom. And consequently, the inner basket is resting on the ground and not inside the outer basket. Therefore, once the get lands inside the inner basket, she is indeed divorced because this ground in the middle is considered her ground, and therefore it acquires the get for her, and that's why they are divorced. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 8. We'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 5. Let's see if I can answer a couple questions. On Gittin 79, Aoife says, what if the get was thrown into an open fire set in the wife's courtyard so that she did not and could not have read it or even touched it? How can that be considered as her receiving it? And I think that you must have asked that before we came to it, because it said, right, like if it was ascending or if there was a chance that the wind was going to blow it and it was only destined to be burned, then no. Right? So if he's throwing it into a fire and it was a clear risk when he threw it that it could land in the fire, it sounds like no, then he never gave it, because it was predictable that it would be burned, and therefore no divorce. Right? It was only this unexpected damage where the get should have landed in a safe and secure spot in her courtyard, and then something happened within her courtyard that caused it to be damaged, but that was unpredictable that they would be considered divorced. But if it was always headed for destruction, then it sounds like they would not be divorced. Aoife also says, does a husband have to specifically agree with the wife that anywhere on his property that she is standing when the get is thrown at her is officially lent to her, or can there be retroactive lending? Aoife, you understand the matter very well. That's the perfect question to ask, and I don't know the answer. I feel like they haven't really clarified if he's lending her a portion of his property in order so that she can receive the get. So what are the particulars of that lending? And does she have to agree that she is borrowing that piece of property in order for it to acquire the get for her? I don't think they've specified that, and I don't know. I don't know how we can say that we know she has, borrowed that piece of property for the purpose of acquiring the get. I don't know how we define that so that it sticks. And Joe asks, the rabbis created laws to put a fence around the Torah. Why did they not write laws stating exact parameters to create a get with respect for the marriage and the two people in the marriage? Stating the exact parameters to create a get. I mean, you're saying create. I think what you're talking about is to create a divorce, right? We're not talking right now about the definitions of what has to be written in the get. Right now we're talking about the giving of it, right? And so I think what you're asking is, why didn't they just say, okay, give it into her hand. And if she won't take it, then you should do A, B, C, and D. They probably should have done that. And maybe they did do that. But I think what they're saying is, given our understanding of what giving means, and let's say we have a standard procedure, probably the standard procedure is the husband and wife go in front of a beis din, right, a rabbinic court, and he hands it to her there in the presence of witnesses where the beis din is administering, the writing, the giving, etc., and there's no room for error. But sometimes it happens that people don't follow the right procedure. They don't go to court. The things were done in a rush. There were exigent circumstances. A marauding army was coming. They were afraid that the husband was going to be killed and his body disappeared. And they needed to create this divorce quickly. And we have to ask, well, given what they did the divorce happen? And now we would rely on all these principles that we're spelling out of these weird occurrences. So how would we apply? Now, it's interesting. They're talking all about airspace, right? I mean, they lived in a time where the only way you were accessing airspace was like a bow and arrow, a spear being thrown, maybe a catapult, right? Or just people throwing things. They couldn't even imagine airplanes, drones, hot air balloons. Yeah. Angels flying, maybe, right? Ezekiel's chariot, maybe. They saw it. Who knows what they saw? Maybe angels and demons, some of them were actually the arrival of aliens that came here 2,000 years ago and said, nice planet, not for us, and then they left. Or maybe they didn't leave. Who knows? So maybe they saw more than we think they saw. But assuming that the only, airborne things, were either thrown or launched, through a simple machine of, slings and arrows, etc., it's amazing how many questions they asked about airspaces, which became much more relevant in the 20th and 21st century when air travel became a thing, when helicopters became a thing, when drones became a thing. And now, the law of airspace is a much more important body of law, under common law. And who would have thought that the sages anticipated all of that thousands of years ago? Amazing, right? Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 80 and Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 8. Have a great night.